Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, as the shadows lengthen and the dust of the day settles upon the ancient land? I wish to carry you across the vast, moon-drenched sands, back to the age when the great stone mountains rose not from nature, but from the faith and measured hand of man, when the Pharaoh's will was made manifest in granite and enduring limestone. This is the world of Keti, the master of royal works, whose dreams were not spun of sleep, but etched onto prepared rolls of papyrus, dictating the very geometry of eternity itself. His position was far more sacred than simple oversight, for Keti was the intermediary between the divine pattern whispered by the gods and the dusty, sweating reality of the workers, ensuring that every angle and dimension adhered strictly to the cosmic order known as Ma'at. He understood that the perfection of the structure was not for the glory of the present moment, but an offering meant to sustain the soul of the ruler for the million years to come, a vessel for immortality that must withstand the slow, erosive breath of time itself. He understood that the perfection of the structure was not for the glory of the present moment, but an offering meant to sustain the soul of the ruler for the million years to come, a vessel for immortality that must withstand the slow, erosive breath of time itself. Keti often stood at the edge of the rising plateau just before the first streak of Anubis's gray light kissed the eastern horizon, watching the massive worksite come slowly, reluctantly alive, a city of labor carved into the desert floor. The air was thin and cool then, carrying only the scent of wet sand and the faint, distant rhythm of the first chisels testing the morning stones. A sound that always felt like the steady, slow heartbeat of the land itself preparing for its daily rebirth. He carried the heavy wooden palette of his office, weighted with the smooth black ink and the red ochre used for correction and divine markings, a constant reminder that he held the power to shape mountains or to cast them down into ruin with a single, misplaced line. This sacred geometry, which he carried not just on the papyrus, but deep within the memory of his own measured stride, demanded absolute precision, understanding that the misalignment of a single cubit in the foundation could invite chaos into the sacred architecture and threaten the pharaoh's passage into the duat. The architect's days were a relentless symphony of measurement, correction, and quiet instruction, moving amongst the enormous granite blocks freshly dragged across the desert plain from Aswan, their surfaces still slick with the protective clay applied for the journey. He would run his weathered hand along the smooth, cool face of a casing stone, recognizing its weight and mass as if it were a living creature, contemplating the thousands of arms that had strained and the thousands of prayers that had been whispered just to bring it to this appointed place. His primary tools were simple yet profound: the plumb bob, ensuring vertical truth; the square, confirming terrestrial rightness; and the merkiet, the sighting instrument used to align the entire structure not with the fleeting lines of the earth, but with the eternal, unchanging stars of the northern sky, particularly the imperishable stars that circled eternally around the pole. He knew that the temple was not merely a building, but a physical diagram of the cosmos, mirroring the path of the sun god Ra as he sailed his bark across the heavens, and thus every wall and corridor had to be oriented to receive the correct astronomical light. Late one afternoon, amidst the clamor of mallets and the creaking of massive wooden rollers, a junior scribe named Irie, his face etched with the concern of a man who had detected a subtle yet profound error in the placement of a key pylon. Erie trembled slightly as he presented the measured rope, showing that the central axis of the approach causeway deviated by the width of a man's thumb from the true north point established years prior during the temple's founding ceremony. Keti did not shout or immediately condemn the oversight, for he understood that human fallibility was a constant struggle against the perfect order the gods demanded, and panic only invited further mistakes into the delicate balance of the construction site. He simply took the rope and walked toward the error, his footsteps measured and slow, insisting that the weight of the structure demanded a patient, philosophical response rather than hurried, angry haste that might further compound the problem. He instructed the surrounding foremen to pause the immediate labor in that sector, creating a sudden, unsettling pocket of silence in the usual torrent of activity, drawing the gaze of dozens of workers waiting for his decisive judgment. Keti then spent the next hour re-establishing the true meridian line, using the long shadow cast by a specially placed obelisk, and meticulously recalibrating the sightings against the distant horizon and the known position of the sun. He explained softly, addressing the young scribe and the foreman alike, that a small deviation in the Earth's plane would become a ruinous, towering imbalance in the heavens, whispering that they were building not just stone upon stone, but eternity upon precision, and that the slightest error compromised the integrity of the Pharaoh's soul itself. The immediate solution required the shifting of 50 tons of cut stone already set into place, a massive undertaking that would cost a full day of labor, but Keti deemed the cost insignificant compared to the divine penalty of asymmetry and the failure of Ma'at. The work of the architect was often solitary, even when surrounded by 10,000 souls, for the divine vision could only be fully grasped by the one tasked with translating celestial thought into earthly matter. Keti would often return to the small shaded chamber where the master plans were kept, rolls of fine linen and papyrus secured under heavy weights, protected from the desert wind and the careless hands of subordinates. Here, under the low light of an oiled lamp, he would study the older texts, the wisdom passed down through generations of builders, the formula for calculating slopes, the specific ratios of height to width that reflected the golden proportion favored by the creator god Ptah, and the ritualistic timing required for laying the capstone during the most auspicious lunar phase. These ancient documents were not merely instructions, they were prayers rendered in geometry, ensuring that the temple was not only structurally sound but spiritually potent, capable of drawing divine energy down into the mortal plane. He remembered his own initiation years ago when his mentor had first led him into the unadorned quarry, forcing him to spend 3 days simply observing the stone, listening to the silence of the earth that held the memory of eons. His mentor had taught him that the true architect does not simply command the stone, but first converses with it, understanding its strengths, its fault lines, and the best way to release its enduring spirit from the mountain's grasp without violence. Every block, whether it was the hard, dark diorite intended for a royal statue or the softer Tura limestone destined for the interior facing walls, had a unique purpose and demanded respect, a philosophy that ensured that the construction was an act of harmonious creation rather than brutal subjugation. This deep reverence for the material meant that waste was considered a spiritual offense, a rejection of the abundance gifted by the earth gods, necessitating meticulous planning to utilize every chip and fragment in the mortar or secondary fillings. This deep reverence for the material meant that waste was considered a spiritual offense, a rejection of the abundance gifted by the earth gods, necessitating meticulous planning to utilize every chip and fragment in the mortar or secondary fillings. The construction itself followed the rhythm of the Nile, dictated by the annual inundation, which provided both the necessary slowdown for deep inspection and the means of transport for the largest, heaviest blocks across the newly flooded plains. During the season of Akhet, when the great river spilled over its banks and brought the life-giving silt, Keti would dedicate himself to the interior work, the placement of the massive roof beams, the carving of the intricate reliefs, and the overseeing of the ritual purification of the chambers. It was during these quiet months that the temple transitioned from a mere shell of stone to a sanctified space, where the sacred images of the gods and the history of the pharaoh were permanently inscribed upon the walls for the benefit of all succeeding generations and the illumination of the afterlife. The hieroglyphs were not decorative. They were living words, spells of potent power intended to bind the spiritual essence of the place and to ensure the perpetual success of the cosmic cycle. But the most challenging aspect of his life was the management of the vast workforce. The thousands of men drawn from every corner of Kemet, bound together by the belief in the pharaoh's divinity and the promise of eternal order. Keti rarely needed the whip or the harsh command, preferring the slow, steady reinforcement of shared purpose, reminding the workers that they were not merely laborers moving inert matter, but the hands of the gods sculpting the vessel of everlasting life. He ensured that the workers were well fed, their rations of bread, beer, and fish plentiful, understanding that a starving or disheartened worker could never achieve the level of precise execution that the gods demanded for their monuments. Their dedication, fueled by this shared sustenance and spiritual clarity, was the true foundation upon which the mighty structures rested, a testament to the belief that collective human effort, when rightly ordered, could touch the realm of the divine. Sometimes, during the brief, cool respite of the midday meal, Keti would sit with the senior masons, men whose hands were as hard and scarred as the granite they shaped, listening to their observations about the quality of the stone or the unexpected behavior of the quarry veins. These master craftsmen possessed an intuitive knowledge that often surpassed the most rigorous calculations of the royal scribes, a deep, practical wisdom born from years spent under the brutal sun, listening to the song of the chisel against the rock face. It was in these simple exchanges, acknowledging the practical truth found on the ground, that Keti truly understood the balance required in his role, the melding of the celestial theoretical geometry handed down by the priesthood with the grounded, material knowledge held by the men who actually brought the vision into existence. The best plans, he knew, were those that honored both the divine straight line and the imperfect curve of human effort. It was in these simple exchanges, acknowledging the practical truth found on the ground, that Keti truly understood the balance required in his role, the melding of the celestial theoretical geometry handed down by the priesthood with the grounded material knowledge held by the men who actually brought the vision into existence. The best plans, he knew, were those that honored both the divine straight line and the imperfect curve of human effort. One evening, as the stars began to appear with impossible clarity above the uncompleted pylons, marking the transition from the earthly world of labor to the celestial world of reckoning, Keti felt a familiar, profound weariness settle into his bones, a weight that was not physical exhaustion, but the constant strain of maintaining perfection. He looked at the immense structure, still raw and incomplete, and understood that his life was a sequence of endless, meticulous preparations for a moment he himself might never witness, the consecration of the fully realized temple, the moment the pharaoh's soul took residence within its walls. He was merely a link in the chain, a temporary custodian of a vision that spanned generations, finding peace in the knowledge that his own small efforts contributed to the eternal continuation of the kingdom and the triumph of light over the surrounding darkness. His existence was defined by measurement, but the meaning of his work was immeasurable. He walked slowly through the massive, echoing central court, soon to be filled with offerings and processions, now only covered with scaffolding and the faint scent of fresh plaster, and paused at the base of the colossal statue intended to guard the entrance. The sculptor had only just begun to rough out the massive features, but even in its embryonic state, the figure held a commanding presence, gazing eastward toward the anticipated rising of the sun. Keti traced the lines of the initial grid drawn upon the stone face, confirming the proportional spacing between the eyes and the chin, ensuring the divine aspect of the pharaoh was precisely captured according to the strict ancient canons of Egyptian art. This statue was destined to endure for 10,000 years, and its perfection was a non-negotiable term of Khetti's contract with eternity. It was this profound connection between the practical labor and the sacred cosmology that gave the architect's life its unique flavor. A constant oscillation between the minute detail of the square meter and the vast sweep of astronomical time. Every block placed, every relief carved, was an act of meditation, a deliberate choice against the natural decay and entropy that governed the mortal world outside the consecrated boundaries of the temple complex. When he finally retired to his simple dwelling near the construction site, built of modest mud brick in stark contrast to the eternal stone he commanded, his sleep was often interrupted not by nightmares, but by the endless calculations and the sightlines of the unfinished walls continuing their relentless march towards the heavens, demanding resolution. He often contemplated the concept of time as seen by the gods, where 1,000 years were but a single sunrise, and understood that his labor, consuming his entire mortal span, was merely the briefest punctuation mark in the eternal narrative of Kemet. He knew that long after his name was forgotten, faded from the stelae of his own tomb, the massive stone structures he had ordered would remain, silently holding the cosmic alignment, teaching the sun where to set and the stars where to rise. This enduring legacy, this participation in the physical embodiment of the divine order, was the greatest reward granted to the master architect. One cool morning, a messenger arrived from the distant capital, bearing delicate gifts for Khetti and a personal message from the vizier himself, praising the speed and structural integrity of the nearly completed hypostyle hall, noting the perfect curve of the massive column capitals. But the message also carried a veiled warning. The vizier, under pressure from the royal treasury, was inquiring about the excessive use of the rare blue pigment lapis lazuli, destined for the ceiling, which was meant to depict the night sky and the passage of the constellations. Khetti paused, letting the silence absorb the faint accusation of extravagance, knowing that his response had to uphold the spiritual necessity of the choice against the secular demands of the gold stores. He dictated a careful reply to the royal scribe, explaining that the celestial ceiling was not merely a decorative element, but the vital map through which the pharaoh's soul would navigate the treacherous paths of the underworld, the duat. He explained that the quality of the pigment was essential because it needed to hold the deep, vibrant truth of the eternal cosmos, reflecting the imperishable stars, and any lesser substitute would compromise the spiritual safety of the living God. The cost, he wrote, was irrelevant when weighed against the immortality of the pharaoh, concluding with the simple, unassailable statement, "We build not for man's coin, but for the endurance of Ma'at." This dedication to spiritual truth over practical economy defined every choice made on the immense building site, from the exactitude of the mortar mix to the solemn procession required to haul the heaviest stones into position. Khetti lived his life as a constant, walking invocation, moving with a calm, deliberate certainty that reassured every man under his command, cementing the belief that their monumental task was sanctified and protected by the great gods of Kemet. The final major component required was the highest point of the structure, the benben, the capstone of the main sanctuary, which had been painstakingly carved and polished in the royal workshops near Memphis, and now waited, wrapped in protective cloths, miles away near the riverbank. This stone, usually covered in electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, represented the primal mound rising from the watery chaos, the very first act of creation by Atum-Ra, and its placement was the culmination of all the years of painstaking effort. Keti spent weeks reviewing the calculations for the enormous ramp system required to elevate the massive, shining stone to the temple's highest roof, a task fraught with danger and demanding flawless synchronization among hundreds of lifting teams. He instructed the foreman overseeing the ramp construction, built primarily of packed mud, rubble, and enormous quantities of interwoven reeds, to test the slopes repeatedly, distributing the weight evenly across every supporting layer, ensuring that no sudden shift or structural weakness could doom the final, crucial ascent. This single moment, the lifting and setting of the benben, held the greatest risk and the greatest spiritual reward. For once the shining capstone was in place, reflecting the fierce light of the sun, the temple would finally be considered spiritually complete, a lighthouse guiding the pharaoh's Ka across the thresholds of death. Keti felt the familiar pressure mount in his chest, the weight of generations resting upon his shoulders, knowing that failure was simply not an option permitted by the gods. The day chosen for the elevation was selected after months of consultation with the royal astronomers, aligning with a specific conjunction of the moon and the star Sirius, ensuring the utmost auspiciousness for the moment of creation's completion. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in hues of rose and fiery gold, the entire construction site fell silent, save for the rhythmic chanting of the priests performing purification rites around the base of the massive ramp. Keti stood at the crest of the ramp, having ascended long before the sun, overseeing the positioning of the final wooden runners, his posture reflecting the perfect, immovable balance he demanded of the structure beneath his feet. The process began with the slow, agonizing pull, hundreds of men straining against the thick, heavy ropes, their synchronized efforts punctuated by the low, steady beat of the foreman's drum, which dictated the measured pace of their ascent. The electrum-covered capstone, secured on its massive sled, moved with deliberate slowness, reflecting the morning light in blinding flashes that symbolized the presence of Ra himself accompanying the stone on its journey upwards toward the solar alignment. Every eye on the site, from the lowest water-bearer to the highest temple official, was fixed upon that single shimmering point, embodying the collective hope and faith that had powered the construction for the duration of the pharaoh's reign. For hours the ascent continued, punctuated by moments of intense silence when the team paused to readjust the rollers or reinforce a straining rope, the tension stretching across the desert air as thin and taut as a bowstring. Finally, just as the sun reached its zenith, casting the sharpest, most defining shadow across the land, the massive capstone slid into its final, perfectly aligned groove atop the sanctuary roof. The collective roar rose from the thousand throats below, a sound not of triumph but of profound relief and fulfilled dedication, marking the moment when the eternal structure finally touched the heavens. Keti remained at the highest point for a long time, the polished stone cool beneath his hands, watching the sunlight play across the desert below and feeling the absolute, flawless stability of the pyramid beneath him. His task was done. The geometry was closed, the divine order preserved in stone, and the pharaoh's path secured for eternity. He thought of the millions of hours of labor, the endless sheets of calculations, and the quiet, spiritual conviction that had driven the impossible feat, recognizing that the true mastery of the architect lay not in the design itself, but in the unwavering ability to sustain the spiritual purpose throughout the years of relentless, difficult execution. As the sun began its slow journey toward the western horizon, casting long, purple shadows that accentuated the monumental scale of the temple, Keti prepared to descend, carrying with him the profound, quiet satisfaction of a man who had successfully negotiated the difficult passage between the mortal earth and the boundless, demanding realm of the gods. The wind now carried only the rustle of the linen flags being hoisted onto the finished pylons, a soft, whispering sound that spoke of peace, permanence, and the enduring order of Kemet. His final act was to command the careful dismantling of the massive ramp system, not violently, but respectfully, ensuring that the materials were conserved and the sacred ground beneath was restored to its intended flatness, erasing the temporary scaffolding that had supported the eternal monument. He knew that the temporary nature of his own life was reflected in the disappearance of the ramp, leaving only the lasting truth of the stone. Keti then departed the sacred grounds, walking away from the structure that represented the culmination of his life's work, knowing that his duty was complete and that his spirit, now having aligned the earth with the stars, was finally at rest. He left the temple to the priests and the gods, certain that the architecture would fulfill its cosmic purpose and ensure the continuance of the divine world order long after the memory of the architect had faded into the desert air. He had created not just a tomb, but a compass pointing to forever, a perfect reflection of Ma'at rendered in the most enduring substance known to man. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Keti turned his back to the monumental complex, his gaze fixed upon the path that led down from the arid plateau back toward the lush green ribbon of the Nile. With every measured step, the perfect geometry he had labored over for decades receded, dissolving into the hazy, heat-shimmered horizon until it became merely a distant, impossible shadow of golden limestone against the vast, empty sky. He now traded the echoing clang of chisels and the rhythmic shouts of thousands of laborers for the profound silence of the desert, a stillness punctuated only by the soft crunch of sand beneath his sandals and the distant cry of a falcon circling overhead. This new quiet was not empty, but filled instead with the deep resonance of completed effort, a peace far more complex than any noise. The path downward was one he had traversed countless times, bearing upward the weight of responsibility and downward the burdens of fatigue. But this time his passage was lightened by the sense of finality and absolute completion. He carried no architectural drafts, no measuring ropes, and no heavy instruments of bronze, bearing only the carefully bound records of his final decisions, and a small wooden tablet inscribed with prayers of gratitude to Thoth, the divine measurer. As he moved away from the plateau where the pharaoh's eternal dwelling now stood, he felt the heavy mantle of the master builder slowly lift from his shoulders, leaving him a man restored to his own simple measure, ready to walk the earth without the constant need to reshape it. He paused only once to observe the angle of the sun against the sheer face of the temple's pylon, affirming one last time that the alignment with the celestial meridian was flawless. After a full day's travel, he reached the small administrative encampment situated safely below the quarry line, where his chief apprentice, the meticulous young Amenhotep, awaited him with humble provisions and a respectful bow. Amenhotep was tasked not with the building of future monuments, but with the careful preservation of those already standing, a duty Keti considered equally sacred. For the relentless erosion of time was a far more subtle and cunning enemy than faulty masonry or hurried construction. Keti sat beside the young man, sharing a simple meal of dried figs and cool water, and spoke not of stress calculations or stone quarries, but of the essential need for deep patience when observing the slow, inevitable shift of the desert dunes and the precise, predictable movement of the stars. The true measure of an architect, he explained softly, lay not in the height of his walls, but in the depth of his understanding of the forces, both earthly and cosmic, that sought eternally to pull them down. He instructed Amenhotep on the necessity of monitoring the subgrade drainage channels, emphasizing that the quiet, unseen work of managing the earth below the foundation was vastly more important than the shining perfection of the facade that met the eye of the worshipper. He gifted the apprentice his personal, sacred plumb line, not as a practical tool for daily use, but as a symbolic reminder that true balance in construction always began with spiritual balance in the heart of the builder. Before departing the next morning, he made Amenhotep swear an oath to Ma'at that he would never compromise the integrity of the stone or the purity of the design for the sake of speed or fleeting political favor, thereby passing the immense, incorruptible burden of the sacred standard to the next generation. Returning to the bustling heart of Waset, the magnificent city of Thebes felt strangely loud after the enforced isolation of the desert plateau and the regulated clamor of the construction site. Yet his own small house was a quiet refuge built around a sun-drenched courtyard filled with the gentle scent of jasmine and the shade of a flourishing fig tree. His personal dwelling, though elegant and perfectly structured for the ease of living, was designed purely for contemplation and repose, a stark, profound contrast to the colossal scale of the sacred edifices he erected for the eternal life of the pharaoh. He spent the entire first evening simply watching the lamp oil burn down, delighting in the small, manageable rhythm of his wife's weaving loom and the familiar comfort of the dust motes dancing in the final golden rays of the setting sun filtering through the high window. Here he was simply Keti, the man who understood geometry, rather than the exalted master architect who commanded legions of stonecutters and scribes. He spent the entire first evening simply watching the lamp oil burn down, delighting in the small, manageable rhythm of his wife's weaving loom and the familiar comfort of the dust motes dancing in the final golden rays of the setting sun filtering through the high window. Here he was simply Keti, the man who understood geometry, rather than the exalted master architect who commanded legions of stonecutters and scribes. Word arrived from the palace in the form of a royal messenger carrying tokens of the pharaoh's deep, enduring favor. Finely wrought collars of gold, bolts of the sheerest linen woven in the delta, and a tract of productive land near the river's fertile edge as a permanent endowment for his family. While he accepted these material blessings with customary reverence and performed the necessary prayers of thanks, Keti understood clearly that the true, immeasurable reward lay not in the accumulation of earthly wealth, which was fleeting, but in the deep, unshakable conviction that he had successfully mediated the divine will into physical, enduring reality. He had achieved the pinnacle of his chosen art, not through seeking accolades or material rewards, but by ensuring that every corner, every column, and every subterranean passage perfectly mirrored the eternal order established at the moment of creation by the Great One. The greatest wealth he possessed was the absolute certain knowledge that Ma'at had finally found a durable, incorruptible human home within the silent heart of the monumental stone. Now, with the frantic urgency of construction banished from his daily thoughts, he devoted long, serene mornings to reviewing the countless scrolls and papyri that detailed his long, demanding career, not merely checking measurements, but tracing the subtle evolution of architectural thought from abstract vision to massive physical structure. These weren't mere technical diagrams detailing load-bearing calculations, they were philosophical maps detailing the arduous journey of the spirit required to translate the immaterial concept of infinity and eternity into the finite, measurable language of blocks and mortar, a precise, visible record of silent meditation. He sought out the most promising young students from the great Père Ankh, the House of Life, sharing with them the vital, profound truth that mathematics was not just a tool for counting labor and materials, but the very divine language through which the gods communicated the structure and harmony of the entire cosmos. To build well was, fundamentally, to think clearly and without confusion, and to think with such geometric clarity was the highest, most dedicated form of worship a man could offer. He would often walk alone to the riverbank at dusk, watching the powerful, predictable surge of the annual inundation and marveling at the perfect balance between the life-giving, cleansing chaos of the rushing waters and the fixed, unmoving banks that perpetually contained their fury. This essential duality, chaos within order, was precisely what he had sought to capture and permanently fix in his temple structures. The boundless, dynamic power of the divine, contained and regulated within the rigid, unyielding discipline of precisely cut and aligned stone, allowing the spiritual life of the kingdom to flourish without succumbing to fatal disorder. Observing the distant stars wheel overhead in their vast, slow progression across the night sky, he recognized in their eternal dance the same immutable laws of proportion and fixed intervals that governed the slant of a pyramid face and the necessary span of a courtyard roof. His entire life's work, he concluded, had been nothing more than learning how to accurately read and then flawlessly replicate the grand, silent, luminous script written across the heavens. Keti understood with a profound, serene clarity that the individual names of the specific architects of Kemet were seldom remembered or recorded upon the great monuments themselves, for the completed structures belonged entirely and absolutely to the pharaoh, who was the conduit of the gods, and to the divine entities they housed. His personal triumph and spiritual legacy lay not in the faint hope of earthly immortality through his name carved into a doorjamb, but in the unshakable certainty that the proportion of the great hypostyle hall, the precise orientation of the entrance axis, and the enduring, load-bearing strength of the ceiling would continue to speak the truth long after his own clay tablet had dissolved to dust. The architect was merely the vessel, the careful, guided hand that held the reed pen and the taut plumb line, ensuring that the pure, sacred essence of the eternal concept passed cleanly and faithfully into the physical world without being muddied by personal ego or mortal error. He was content to gradually fade into the general flow of history, knowing that the pattern he had helped imprint upon the earth would remain bright, true, and functionally perfect for 1,000 generations. Yet sometimes, in the deep quiet of the afternoon, when the sun was high and the house was silent, the unwelcome, heavy memories of the many construction years would suddenly surface, bringing with them the sharp scent of sweat, the agonizing creak of overloaded, splintering sledges, and the muffled, terrible sound of dense stone striking mortal flesh. He never allowed himself to forget the human cost necessarily embedded within the finished splendor of the great edifice, acknowledging that the pursuit of spiritual perfection demanded not only the highest intellectual rigor and technical skill, but also the constant, often painful sacrifice of mortal strength, time, and occasionally life itself. To constantly balance the immense spiritual ambition of the pharaoh with the brutal logistical reality of moving mountains of rock was the constant, necessary ethical burden of the master builder, forcing him always to meditate upon the fine, tenuous line between holy dedication and avoidable human cruelty. He honored the countless departed laborers by ensuring their contribution, whether conscious or accidental, was integrated flawlessly and securely into the everlasting form, thereby making their brief suffering a necessary, permanent part of the eternal structure that served the gods. He observed the passage of the seasons now with the leisurely detachment of a man who no longer had to race against the yearly cycle of the Nile flood to finish a foundation or hoist a massive architrave before the rains arrived. He found pleasure in the subtle changes of the light as it moved across his courtyard, charting its progression with the same rigor he had once used to map the stars over the quarry site, recognizing that true mastery lay in appreciating the small, constant perfection of the everyday world just as much as the overwhelming perfection of the monumental. This quiet observation confirmed his deepest held belief that the whole of existence, from the smallest grain of sand to the largest granite obelisk, was woven from the same singular, sacred thread of immutable, beautiful proportion. Greetings, dear listeners! From where do you join us this evening? Though his hands now rested upon the smooth, polished railing of his veranda, feeling only the sun-warmed cedar wood, his memory still retained the ghostly, massive friction of granite pressed against granite, the soundless grinding of the colossal blocks settling into their final, predestined repose. He often wondered if the structures he had raised held a kind of soundless memory of their own, perhaps humming faintly with the ancient vibrations of the quarry face from which they were violently torn, or echoing the muffled prayers offered by the workers beneath them. The cessation of the physical labor did not bring an end to the architectural contemplation, but merely relocated it, transforming the raw effort of the muscle into the refined effort of the spirit, seeking to truly understand the immutable forms he had only previously been mandated to create. He recalled one agonizing sunrise when the great, slender obelisk, destined to pierce the sky and capture the sun's first ray, hung suspended by ropes thick as a man's torso, swaying slightly, threatening destruction should the ground shift or a pulley fail. For one timeless, terrifying moment that stretched beyond the measure of breath, the fate of the entire project, the reputation of his craft, and the lives of 100 men depended solely upon the absolute, unwavering mathematical integrity of the calculations made years prior in the quiet of his scriptorium. It was in moments such as these that the architect truly touched the realm of the divine, not merely building for the gods, but briefly assuming the mantle of fundamental cosmic law, aligning earthbound material with celestial geometry through sheer, terrifying human will enforced by rope and timber. The years spent handling the materials had taught him that the stone itself possessed an ancient patience, a knowledge far older than the ephemeral ambition of the pharaoh who commanded its shaping, holding silent witness to epochs of transformation. Limestone carried the faded history of the primordial sea, packed with the countless shells of creatures that lived and died before the concept of kingship existed, while the enduring granite spoke of the earth's own forging fire, resisting all tools but yielding only to the most focused, persistent human attention and ceaseless effort. The true master builder understood that his role was not to defeat the stone, but to convince it, gently yet firmly, to exchange its wild, chaotic natural form for a structured, eternal geometric perfection that magnified its internal mineral essence. He remembered the deep frustration of his apprentices, young men eager to master the necessary formulae and the complex ratios derived from the sacred second, but often failing to grasp the crucial concept of feeling the line, of understanding the weight and balance intuitively before the reed pen ever touched the papyrus. They learned the geometry of the triangle and the square with precision, yet struggled to comprehend that the perfect angle was not merely a matter of measurement, but a subtle echo of the human body's own divine structure and the turning of the distant celestial spheres in their constant, majestic orbit. He would often counsel them that the greatest structures were drawn not by the hand or the calculating eye alone, but by the disciplined heart and the meditative mind, channeling the unspoken harmony that existed everywhere in the world, awaiting quiet revelation. Now, sitting in the deep quiet of his later years, he often felt he could still hear the ghost of the sounds that defined his working life, rising gently through the years like heat haze from the desert floor. The rhythmic clack-clack of the bronze chisels, The distant, mournful songs sung by the gangs hauling the sledges of stone, and the deep, unsettling roar of the Nile's waters pouring into the channels during the yearly inundation. Yet, the most profound sound was always the sudden, comprehensive silence that fell when a great wall or a towering pylon was finally complete, the moment when all human clamor ceased and the building stood alone, testing its new existence against the indifferent vastness of the Egyptian sky. That enduring silence, vast and perfect, became the vessel into which the prayers of the ages would be poured, thereby giving the massive structure its true, immortal voice that would speak to generations yet unborn. Even in sleep, his mind had never truly rested from the burden of proportion and stability, often presenting him with complex, crystalline visions of stress fractures, vanishing points, and impossible geometries that he was forced to solve before the sun rose high enough to cast shadows upon his bedchamber floor. These nocturnal explorations were the secret quarries of his creativity, places where the very gods themselves seemed to dictate the precise length of a column drum or the required slope of a ramp, demanding a fidelity to the unseen laws of physics that bordered upon sacred revelation and absolute obedience. Waking from such vivid nights, he would rush immediately to his writing board, driven by the certainty that the blueprint he possessed was not his own invention, but a divine transcription, carefully prepared for the mortal hand to execute upon the physical surface of the earth. He knew better than any man alive that the true measure of architectural strength lay not in the soaring height or the brightly polished facade, but in the unseen, deeply buried courses of stone that anchored the entire endeavor to the eternal bedrock beneath the desert sand, providing crucial stability against the forces of erosion and upheaval. These foundational layers, often clumsy, rough-hewn, and forever hidden from the critical gaze of men or kings, were afforded the very same meticulous precision as the final capstone, for they alone bore the crushing weight of all earthly ambition and celestial aspiration directed upward. The architect's ethical duty demanded that the hidden parts be as true and as beautiful in their structure as the visible, understanding implicitly that integrity must permeate the entirety of existence, from the deepest subterranean root to the highest shining crown that greets the sun. The structures he had raised were not merely buildings, useful only for the span of one lifetime. They were physical declarations intended to resist the corrosive effects of time, monuments designed to make the passing centuries seem brief and inconsequential in the face of immutable form. He thought of the eventual silence that would descend upon the land after the passing of the current dynasty, when perhaps even the precise names of the gods would subtly shift or fade from the memories of the populace. Yet the massive masonry would remain, speaking only the universal language of mass, gravity, and scale to anyone who gazed upon it. In this profound continuation of form across countless epochs, the architect found his only true form of human permanence, knowing his soul was eternally written into the enduring heart of the stone, far outlasting the fragile papyrus upon which his initial plans were first drawn and now turned to dust. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, seeking respite and wisdom in the telling of ancient crafts? The architect often found himself alone upon the shifting, moon-dusted plateau in the quiet hours before the overseers awoke, listening not to the distant murmur of the sleeping labor camp, but to the profound geological silence of the desert floor itself. This vast, patient stillness held the secrets of immense time, absorbing all human sound and emotion, leaving only the sound of his own disciplined breathing and the faint, grinding friction of the wind against the immovable stone faces he had already raised. He had long since learned to trust the intuitive knowledge gained from the granite beneath his calloused palm, knowing instantly whether the fissure ran too deep or if the cleavage plane was fundamentally sound. A sacred knowledge derived not from dusty scrolls, but from countless hours of silent, attentive communion with the heavy earth. His implements, the sacred plumb line, the wooden square, the water-filled level, were not merely practical tools of measurement. They were cherished extensions of his own ethical mind, demanding uncompromising truth and rejecting the smallest deviation from the ideal mathematical forms dictated by the creator god Ptah. The discipline required to maintain such relentless, unforgiving accuracy across millions of tons of assembled rock mirrored the profound spiritual discipline required to maintain an ordered and upright soul, ensuring that no internal weakness or momentary lapse compromised the eternal, structural strength of the divine resting place he was charged with securing. He recognized that the living king, though rightly revered as the majestic incarnation of the falcon god Horus upon the earthly plane, was nonetheless bound by the short, fragile arc of human years. His powerful voice booming commands across the worksite only for a brief generation before fading into a historical whisper. Yet the architect's truest master was not the pharaoh who provided him with grain and titles, but the immense, silent, indifferent weight of the very stone blocks themselves, which obeyed only the immutable, eternal laws of physics, demanding absolute honesty in every mortar joint, and demanding perfect truth in every deep foundation layer. He recalled the arrogance of a visiting vizier who, seeking to impress the court, had once suggested a minor, time-saving shortcut in the placement of secondary ventilation shafts. A blasphemous proposal the architect had met with a cold, terrifying silence that spoke volumes about the inviolable nature of the sacred work. Such a shortcut, though it would have been entirely invisible to the hurried eye of the royal inspector or the passing layman, would have constituted a fundamental lie told directly to the heart of the earth itself, weakening the metaphysical bridge between this world and the duat, and thus gravely compromising the cosmic order woven into the structure. Though the overwhelming physical labor was achieved through the straining backs and blistered hands of thousands of common men, the foundational magic of the entire great house resided first and foremost in the meticulous calculations performed by the army of dedicated scribes laboring within the shaded coolness of the planning chambers. These humble men hunched patiently over thin sheets of oiled papyri, meticulously translating the architect's mental vision into perfect, precise angles and endless, complex fractional notations, handled the very essence of creation through mathematical symbols, transforming chaotic raw intent into flawlessly ordered, enduring reality. The architect himself held a deep, unshakable reverence for the precise sacred geometry that governed the slope of the smooth casing stones and determined the critical orientation of the innermost passages, believing firmly that these specific mathematical truths represented the clearest, most direct language spoken by the primordial gods themselves. The architect himself held a deep, unshakable reverence for the precise sacred geometry that governed the slope of the smooth casing stones and determined the critical orientation of the innermost passages, believing firmly that these specific mathematical truths represented the clearest, most direct language spoken by the primordial gods themselves. He understood with chilling clarity that if a single digit were carelessly transposed, or if the angle of descent for the king's passage were miscalculated by even the smallest fraction of a degree, the intended passage of the royal Ka upon resurrection would be disrupted, tragically rendering the entire massive, generations-long effort utterly meaningless in the eyes of eternity. Furthermore, this vast, relentlessly hungry operation was sustained not by magic alone, but by the continuous, annual bounty of the life-giving Nile, for the monumental effort of shaping and raising the stone was impossible without the continuous flow of food, fresh water, and vital bronze tools transported by sturdy barge and heavy sled from the fertile delta far to the north. He made it a personal ritual to walk down regularly to the temporary harbor constructed on the river's edge, observing the gigantic limestone carriers docking with slow, measured grace, their massive hulls laden with dazzling white materials quarried from the cliffs of Tura, or bearing the hard, dark basalt reserves mined thousands of miles away far to the deep south. This endeavor required a logistical mastery that demanded not only brilliant engineering genius in the arrangement of the stone, but also the profound political and administrative skill necessary to manage the provisioning of 30,000 souls, while maintaining absolute civil harmony under the relentless, oppressive heat of the desert sun. He viewed the massive project not merely as a complex assemblage of millions of stone blocks, but rather as a living, breathing mechanism drawing its life-giving resources from the entire breadth of Kemet, fundamentally symbolizing the divine, purposeful unification of the two lands in service of the ultimate royal and celestial objective. Decades had long since passed since he first set foot upon this dusty, desolate plateau, arriving as a young man armed only with a simple measuring cord and the staggering vision granted to him by his royal master. And now his aging hair was perpetually streaked with the fine white dust of the very limestone he had spent his entire life shaping and perfecting. He knew with a calm resignation that he would likely never live to see the final, glorious moment of the project's completion, for the pace of such eternal undertakings routinely exceeded the natural, fleeting span of any single human existence. But this profound realization brought him a deep sense of tranquil peace rather than any personal sorrow. The truly wise architect understood that he was merely one necessary, strong link in a colossal chain of knowledge stretching infinitely back into the deep past and reaching infinitely forward into the unfathomable future, contributing his crucial portion of perfect, truthful work before yielding the sacred, unending task to his own skilled successor and apprentices. His ultimate legacy, therefore, would not be written upon his own small, functional tomb stele, which would remain modest and humble compared to the mountainous glory he had devoted his life to creating, but rather indelibly inscribed in the unwavering, mathematically precise lines and tunnels that forever pierce the celestial vault, guaranteeing the safety and eternal ascent of the king's soul. He sometimes pondered the nature of the workers he commanded, those simple men who labored under the weight of the sun, seeing only the immediate task of lifting and pulling, utterly unaware of the larger cosmic and geometric significance of the enormous block they were struggling to shift into its perfect position. It was the architect's lonely duty to hold the entirety of the metaphysical blueprint within his own mind, ensuring that the necessary toil of the many was harmoniously aligned with the divine will of the one, transforming sweat and muscle into timeless, eternal form. The sheer scale of the vision required him to detach himself from the common, fleeting concerns of the market and the city, demanding a clarity of purpose that few outside his silent, measured world could ever truly comprehend or sustain. He carried the weight of the future upon his shoulders, knowing that every decision he made, every angle he approved, every stone he designated would endure thousands of years beyond the memory of the specific men who set it in place, influencing the very landscape of Kemet long after the names of all his colleagues and detractors had been thoroughly washed away by the relentless sands of time. This required a constant, vigilant awareness, a spiritual alertness akin to that of the high priests performing the most vital temple rites, for a lapse in concentration could undo a decade of honest work and compromise the entire structure intended for the king's transition. He maintained daily records not only of the measurements and materials consumed, but also meticulous, secret chronicles detailing the changing intensity of the sunlight during the solstices and the precise elevation of the brightest stars during the crucial hours of the night, integrating celestial movement directly into the terrestrial monument. The great house was intended to serve as a perfectly calibrated observatory of the heavens and the terrestrial anchor for the spirit, demanding that the mathematics of the stone perfectly reflect the divine, flawless geometry of the distant constellations as they moved silently across the night sky above. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, seeking respite beneath the guiding stars? The moment the architect finally rolled and secured the sacred papyri, sealing the calculations of the eternal geometry, he shed the cool, mathematical stillness of his high observatory and faced the consuming reality of the worksite below. The transition was always jarring, moving from the silent perfection of flawless numbers to the brutal, chaotic energy of thousands of men laboring beneath a sun that cared nothing for divine proportion, intent only on drawing sweat from skin and dust from the very bedrock of Kemet. He took a moment on the shaded threshold of his dwelling, letting his eyes adjust to the blinding, reflective glare bouncing off the vast expanse of white limestone rubble that stretched toward the hazy horizon, preparing his spirit for the necessary descent into the realm of organized human effort and inevitable physical friction. This daily movement from the realm of the celestial blueprint to the terrestrial implementation was the true core of his priesthood, the practical magic of transforming a cosmic idea into an enduring mountain of stone that would anchor the Pharaoh to eternity. He moved through the maze of scaffolding and temporary structures, greeted by the low bows of the chief foremen, who were the indispensable bridge between the architect's celestial vision and the strained muscles of the thousands of haulers and cutters. These men, hardened by years of sun and dust, depended utterly upon the flawless accuracy of the plans he provided, understanding that a single erroneous measurement, misinterpreted by 1,000 hands, could consume months of effort and jeopardize the entire sacred timeline dictated by the solar cycle. He demanded from them not just brute efficiency, but a shared reverence for the hidden geometry, reiterating daily that the weight of the king's transition demanded that speed never be allowed to encroach upon the sanctity of absolute precision. Reviewing the logs, he noted the specific quarries from which the massive Aswan granite for the burial chamber had been extracted, ensuring that the stone, imbued with the deep, enduring strength of the southern land, was directed only to the most critical, internal components of the monument. The architect walked along the designated routes, his attention drawn not merely to the quantity of blocks being moved, but to the silent language of the stone itself, tracing the marks of the mason's copper chisels upon the newly exposed surfaces. He paused to run his hand over a fresh block of Tura limestone, feeling the surprisingly cool consistency beneath the dust, acknowledging the deep, slow geological time contained within its structure, a time that dwarfed the brief span of the Pharaoh's reign and the lives of the men shaping it. This physical connection was essential, a reminder that the great house was a fusion of cosmic energy and earthly material, and that the spirit of the stone needed to be respected and properly aligned with the spirit of the purpose it was destined to serve. He inspected the smoothness of the casing stones intended for the exterior, knowing they must fit edge to edge with a seamless fidelity that would turn the structure into a single, light-reflecting crystal, protecting the inner sanctum from the ravages of wind and elemental decay. One of the greatest logistical feats was the maintenance and constant adjustment of the colossal ramp system, a vast, temporary structure of mud brick and gypsum that enveloped the growing monument like a protective skin, necessary for lifting the enormous weight to impossible heights. Hemi observed the teams of haulers straining against the thick, wet ropes, synchronized by the high, rhythmic chant of the taskmaster, transforming the immense inertia of a 50-ton block into a slow, inexorable upward crawl against the pull of the earth. He spent critical hours with the overseer of the ramps, recalculating the necessary modifications for the next week's ascent, ensuring the gradient remained perfectly calibrated, steep enough to gain vertical height efficiently, yet gentle enough to prevent the catastrophic backslide of the loaded sledges that would inevitably crush the men beneath. Despite the rigid discipline and the carefully managed pace, the inherent dangers of working at such a scale were an ever-present shadow, and accidents, though thankfully infrequent, were met with profound solemnity by the architect and his inner circle. When a heavy limestone cornice slipped on a muddy turn, or a thick rope snapped under an unforeseen strain, causing injury or the ultimate sacrifice, Hemi felt the immediate, raw pain of the loss, recognizing the profound human cost woven into the monument's eternal fabric. The fallen man was honored not as a disposable laborer, but as an essential, dedicated fragment of the collective spirit, whose contribution was deemed worthy of offerings to ensure his soul's swift and safe passage into the Western lands, reminding all that the pyramid was built not only with stone and calculation, but also with the dedicated life force of the inhabitants of Kemet. As the exterior shell rose with magnificent, visible speed, the complexity of the interior structure demanded the architect's focus shift inward toward the dark, hidden geometries that determined the monument's spiritual function. Here, far from the sun's light and the cheers of the haulers, lay the precise placement of the king's chamber, and, even more critically, the complex, invisible system of relieving chambers built directly above it, engineered to displace the unimaginable vertical compression of the entire mountain of rock. These vital, internal alignments could not rely on visual checks. They were achieved solely through the precise leveling of water in long, narrow troughs and the absolute stillness of polished plumb lines, ensuring that the sacred burial vessel would rest in a space perfectly level, flawless in its horizontal stability, regardless of the immense, shifting weight pressing down from above and the subtle tremors of the earth below. The construction of the Grand Gallery presented its own unique challenge, an ascending, high-vaulted passage that served as both a ceremonial route and a necessary structural element, demanding an unprecedented mastery of corbelling, the technique of setting each course of wall stone inward, slightly overhanging the previous one, until the apex was closed. Hemi spent long, tedious hours within the stifling confines of this rising shaft, his lamp casting huge, dancing shadows, personally verifying the angle of every single stone set by the masons, knowing that a structural weakness here would eventually compromise the entire central axis of the pyramid. The mathematical sequence required for the corbelling had to be flawless, creating an internal space that was both immense and perfectly load-bearing. An inverted ship's hull of stone, designed to channel the pharaoh's spirit upward toward the apex and the celestial northern pole. His preoccupation with the unseen alignment extended even to the ventilation shafts, or star shafts, which were not simple air passages, but carefully angled conduits intended to align the burial chamber with specific constellations vital to the king's eternal rebirth and journey. These shafts were minuscule in comparison to the immense stones surrounding them, but their deviation by even the breadth of a finger could render the entire cosmic mechanism useless, failing to catch the light of Orion or the silent stability of the star Thuban. Therefore, every block that abutted these shafts had to be placed with an extraordinary level of attention, often requiring the use of specialized, small tools and carefully angled mirrors to check the sightlines, ensuring the path remained perfectly straight and uncompromised through the core of the monument. This work, performed by the most trusted and specialized masons under Hemi's direct, whispered instructions, was entirely unseen by the masses, representing the secret heart of the great house. The architect also devoted significant energy to the management of the vast, temporary housing city established adjacent to the plateau. The immense infrastructure needed to feed, house, and organize the tens of thousands of skilled craftsmen, quarrymen, and seasonal laborers who flooded the area during the inundation season. Maintaining order, morale, and health within this transient community was essential to the continuation of the divine work, for a disgruntled or sickly workforce would compromise the sacred timetable more certainly than a failed rope. He supervised the quality of the grain stores and the cleanliness of the water channels with the same vigilance he applied to the angles of the stone, understanding that the health of the men was fundamentally linked to the spiritual health and success of the entire monumental endeavor. Every detail, from the distribution of wages to the provision of simple medical salves, was a necessary act of piety toward the great purpose. As the years passed and the base grew wider and the sides angled higher, the practical challenges shifted from lifting the first layer of stones to navigating the rapidly increasing height and the sheer volume of material needed for the upper courses. Hemi initiated the meticulous planning for the transition to the secondary inner ramp system, which would be utilized once the vast outer ramps became impractical, a complex engineering maneuver that required moving the primary stone routes without interrupting the flow of material for more than a few days. The entire worksite resembled a gigantic, slow-motion machine, powered by sun and human will, and the architect's role was to be the oil in every joint and the unwavering calculation in every moving part, ensuring the synchronization of thousands of distinct operations into one singular ascending effort aimed at the heavens. He often remained on the plateau long after the setting sun had turned the limestone a deep, soft apricot, and the majority of the workers had descended to their barracks, waiting for the clarity of the desert night to reveal the celestial alignments once more. Standing alone amid the silent, immense forms of the rising structure, he would consult his star charts, confirming the precise moment the chosen stars crossed the meridian that corresponded to the pyramid's axis, reassuring himself that the terrestrial structure was flawlessly rising into its preordained position as a beacon for the eternal soul. It was in these cool, silent hours that the true scale of his responsibility settled most profoundly upon him. The awareness that he was not merely building for a pharaoh, but for time itself, creating an anchor of permanence in a world defined by its ceaseless, fleeting change. A structure intended to outlast every known civilization and every ephemeral belief held by the men below.